The Vethkai called it the Spire of Unmaking. Humans called it the Diamond Pyramid, because that was what it looked like from orbit, a single crystalline tooth jutting from the fog-draped surface of Karath 9, throwing back the light of a dying red dwarf in prismatic blades that could be seen from 600 kilometers out. The science teams who had named it were dead now. So were the survey crew who'd come after them. That made this the third response in 8 months, and Maren Voss had stopped counting the names of the people who didn't come home. She stood at the forward viewport of the rescue corvette Threshold, her coffee going cold in her hand, watching the planet grow. Behind her, the rest of the squad moved through the low-ceilinged corridor in the particular way that soldiers move before a landing, slow and deliberate, checking straps and charge levels, and the small private talismans people carry when they think nobody's looking. Dak had his daughter's braid clipped to the inside of his helmet. Ren touched the scar on his jaw exactly 3 times before seating his rebreather. Tomas, who was too young to have a talisman yet, just watched Maren and did whatever she did, which was why she made sure to keep her face still. Vethkai patrol signatures on long-range scan, said their ship's intelligence Cora, in the flat tone it used for things it considered non-urgent. 3 units, standard Sentinel configuration. Circling the impact radius of the second survey vessel at 12-minute intervals. They're guarding a wreck, Dak said. They're guarding what's near it, Maren said. The spire. The spire. She finally turned from the viewport and took one long drink of cold coffee before setting it down with the precision of someone who intends to pick it up again when this is over. The squad watched her. She unclipped her plasma torch from the charging bracket on the wall and slung it over her shoulder. She did not say anything inspirational. She had tried that once on her second deployment, and the 3 people she'd inspired had died inside the next 4 hours. Now she just got her gear on and let them read what they needed into the silence. Cora, she said, descent window. 11 minutes. I recommend an offset approach. The Sentinel drones appear to lack detection range beyond 40 degrees from the pyramid's central axis. If you come down in the eastern fog bank, thermal diffusion should mask the threshold signature on entry. You recommend? I do. Then we'll do the other thing. Cora paused, that fractional digital hesitation that Maren had learned to read as something close to exasperation. May I ask why? Because the last 2 crews came in quiet and didn't make it out. We're going to land loud and fast and see what that kicks up before we go looking for survivors. She checked the charge on her torch. 92%. Also, the eastern fog bank is where they found the second ship. She did not say, I'm not going to descend into that fog and find 216 more dead people in a hull that used to be full of names I knew. She did not say it because the squad already knew it, and because saying true things out loud sometimes makes them heavier than they need to be before a fight. The descent was violent. Not because of the threshold's approach. Cora handled that with mechanical efficiency, burning hard into the atmosphere at an angle that would have made a standard pilot wince, shaving minutes off the exposure window. The violence was the world itself. Karath 9 had an atmosphere like a bruise, heavy sulfur yellow cloud layers at 30,000 meters, then a sheer zone of crosswinds that hit the hull like a fist, then a lower layer of thin brown fog that sat over the surface like something ashamed of what it was hiding. Maren braced herself in the drop harness and watched the altimeter count down and did not let her jaw clench, because the squad would see it. 300 meters above the surface, Cora said, Sentinel contact. The first impact hit the hull like a hammer on an oiled drum. The second knocked the lights out for half a second. Maren dropped her harness release and was on her feet before the emergency strips came back on. Suppression fire on my mark, she said. Dak torch, Ren left flank. Tomas. I know, Tomas said. He was already moving. The rear hatch blew and the brown fog came in and Maren went out into it first, because that was the arrangement, and the first thing she saw was a Vethkai Sentinel drone 40 meters out, a machine the size of a tank and roughly the shape of one, flat-armored and low-slung, its emitter array already cycling up to fire. She had time to think. They're faster than the reports said. Then Dak's plasma torch opened up beside her and the Sentinel's left track assembly went molten and it spun sideways, still firing, its beams cutting long orange lines through the fog at knee height. She went flat. The beams passed over her. She came up firing. What the debrief would later describe as a contact engagement of approximately 14 minutes was not 14 minutes as Marin experienced it. It was a collection of frozen images. Dak taking a glancing hit across the shoulder and going down, then getting up again because he was Dak. Ren flanking wide through the fog and finding the Sentinel's command housing, a flat panel on the machine's right side, accessible, almost insultingly obvious, and simply switching it off. The machine shuddering to a stop like a toy whose batteries had died. The second Sentinel arriving from the north and Tomas, who was 23 years old and had never been in a ground engagement before, stepping into its path with a portable disruptor array and nullifying its guidance system with 6 seconds of concentrated magnetic burst. It drove in a slow circle, blind, until it hit an outcropping of crystal and stopped. Marin stood in the settling fog and listened. The red dwarf's light came down through the haze in bloody streaks, catching the crystal formations that jutted from the ground in irregular clusters, not natural, or not entirely natural, the angles too deliberate, the spacing too even. In the middle distance, barely visible through the haze, the spire caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 colors that had no business existing on a world this dead. "Report," she said. "Good," Dax said, which meant nothing was broken, or at least nothing he was acknowledging. "Fine," said Ren. Tomas was sick on the ground for a moment, then straightened up and said, "Ready." "Cora," Marin said, touching her comm, "where's the distress beacon?" 112 meters northeast. The signal has been cycling for approximately 70 hours. It's fragmented. I'm detecting significant degradation, consistent with a unit damaged in a hull breach. 70 hours, Dax said. "Someone still alive," Tomas said. "Or the beacon's on a timer," Ren said. Marin was already moving. "Come on." The terrain between the landing site and the beacon was wrong in the way that things on alien worlds are sometimes wrong. Not dramatically, not in any one specific thing you could point to, but in the aggregate wrongness of a place that had developed under completely different rules. The crystal formations grew denser as they moved northeast, rising from knee height to shoulder height to, in some places, 2 meters or more, their facets catching and holding the dwarf light in deep interior fires of amber and violet. The ground underfoot was not quite soft and not quite hard. Every footstep made a sound like paper tearing. Marin noticed that nothing, not an insect, not a microorganism slick on the crystal faces, nothing moved except her squad. The first survey team's equipment was the first thing they found, or what was left of it. The cases were cracked open, not by explosion but by something more deliberate, each one open from the outside, the contents removed and arranged in a pattern on the ground that might have been random and might not have been. Data units, sample containers, medical equipment, a personal recorder still running, its red light winking up from the ground. Ren picked it up. "Don't," Marin said. He put it down. He knew she was right. You didn't stop for the dead when there were still living to find. But she saw the thing in his face that she recognized from her own chest, the small protest of it, the grief that insists on a moment even when there isn't one. They found the beacon 18 meters further in, and the woman next to it. She was seated with her back against a crystal formation 4 meters high, and at first Marin thought she was dead because her stillness was the wrong kind of stillness, too complete, the stillness of a body that has stopped organizing itself. Then the woman's eyes opened. They were gray and very clear, and they tracked immediately to Marin's face with the focused intelligence of someone who had been conserving themselves for exactly this moment. "You came," the woman said. Her voice was wrecked, dehydrated, dust-raw. "I thought they wouldn't send anyone else." "We always send someone," Marin said. She was already on her knees, running a med scanner across the woman's torso. 2 cracked ribs, dehydration. A burn along her left forearm that had been bandaged with strips torn from her uniform sleeve, the bandage stiff with dried plasma. Marin pulled her kit and started working. "What's your name?" "Lydia Vers, second survey ship. We landed 73 hours ago." "The Sentinels." "We lost 4 people on landing. The machines patrol the outer perimeter. There are more of them deeper in." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, that deliberate effort at staying present that Marin recognized as a skill you acquired. But that's not what killed the first team. Then what did? Lydia's eyes moved to the spire. "There's something in it, inside the pyramid. I couldn't get close enough to understand what it is, but it resonates." The professor said it was a frequency weapon, set to a bandwidth that disrupts biological tissue at the cellular level. She paused. The first team must have gotten within 100 meters of it without shielding. Marin had seen the first team's medical reports. She had not needed to read them twice. "How far does the kill radius extend?" "Active," Lydia looked at her steadily. "The whole planet, maybe further." The fog moved. Somewhere in the crystal forest, something made a sound like wind through a broken hull, low, resonant, harmonic. The spire. Marin felt it in her back teeth rather than heard it, a vibration at the edge of perception that her body knew was wrong before her mind had processed it. "It's cycling up," Lydia said. "How long?" "I don't know." The professor thought maybe 12 hours after it began the active phase. But that was 30 hours ago. Marin stood up. She looked at Dak. He looked back at her with the expression he used when he already knew what she was about to say and had already decided to go along with it. "Can you walk?" she asked Lydia. "Yes." "Tomas, take her." She was already moving. "We're going to the spire." They had been moving for 6 minutes when they found the old ones. There was no other way to describe them. They were seated in a hollow between 2 large crystal formations, and they were very old, the kind of old that has gone past age and into something else, the kind that does not look frail because frailty implies the possibility of becoming young again. They were Vethkai. Or they had been Vethkai once. The secondary carapace that characterized the AI warrior caste was gone from them, leaving only the soft underlayer, the pale chitin skin that the carapace was meant to protect. They were unarmored and unarmed, and they sat very still among the crystals and watched Marin's squad arrive with large dark eyes that held something she could not immediately identify. Her hand had already raised her plasma torch before she understood that she was not going to fire it. Because the old ones were not alone. Clustered around them, pressed against their sides, curled in the warmth of their bodies, draped across their laps in the trusting abandon of very young things everywhere, were Vethkai young. The pups. Chitinous and small, the size of human infants, their undeveloped carapaces soft and pale and translucent at the edges. They made no sound. Some of them were watching Marin with the same wide dark eyes as the old ones. Several were sleeping. One of them, she noticed, had been injured, a scorch mark across its right shoulder plate, and had been bandaged. The bandage was human, medical tape from a survey kit. Lydia from behind her said quietly, "They were there when we landed. The old ones, I mean. The pups arrived about 12 hours in. I don't know where they came from. The old ones kept bringing them here, one at a time, over the first 2 days." She paused. "I think they were protecting them." "From the Sentinels," Ren said. "From the spire," Lydia said. "The Sentinel drones serve whoever controls the spire, and whoever controls it now, it isn't them." Marin lowered her torch. The old ones watched her. The one on the left, slightly larger, its eyes a shade deeper, made a sound. Low, resonant, nothing like the spire's frequency. Something organic. A sound that had a texture to it, an intention, even if she had no way to decode what that intention was. Cora, she said, touching her comm. The Vethkai language structure is not in my standard database, Cora said from her earpiece, but I have partial translation matrices from the first survey team's recordings. If you keep them talking, I can attempt a real-time analysis. I should note, another fractional pause. The elder to your left appears to be in some physical distress. Inconsistent respiratory rhythm. I would estimate significant internal injury consistent with either blast trauma or prolonged exposure to the spire's resonance field. They're dying, Tomas said. It was not a question. If the spire reaches full activation cycle, Cora said, everything on this planet is dying. Dak had moved up beside Marin. He was looking at the pups. He had the expression on his face that she had only ever seen twice before, once when they'd found the children in the wreckage on Callion, and once when his daughter sent a birthday message that reached the ship 14 months after it was sent because of the relay delay, and he'd opened it and gone very quiet for a long time. He said nothing. He touched the braid clipped inside his helmet. "What's the play?" Ren said. Marin thought about the first team. She thought about the second team and their arranged equipment and their lost data units. She thought about Lydia's bandaged arm and the fact that Lydia had, in 73 hours on a hostile alien planet while injured and alone, found the time to put medical tape on a wounded Vethkai pup the size of a house cat. She thought about what kind of people they sent on survey missions, and what kind of people became survey scientists, and what the AI warrior caste thought those kinds of people were worth. She looked at the old ones. "Ask them," she said to Cora. "Ask them what the spire is and who controls it and how we shut it down." In that order. What followed was 12 minutes of Cora doing something Marin suspected the AI would classify as the hardest thing it had ever done, synthesizing partial linguistic matrices and real-time acoustic analysis and educated guesswork into something that approximated communication between two species that had no common ground, except the fact that they were both standing on a planet that was trying to kill them. The old ones were patient. They did not hurry. They made their low, resonant sounds and waited while Cora worked, and the pups slept and watched, and once, Marin would think about this for a long time afterward, the smaller old one reached out a four-fingered hand and placed it briefly on Tomas's knee. He went completely still. He let it stay there. What Cora eventually extracted, with significant caveats about translation confidence, was this. The spire was old, older than the Vethkai themselves, or at least older than the current form of their civilization. It was a resonance amplifier built by an ancestor species, a species the Vethkai had names for, but the names didn't translate, and it had sat dormant in the crystal plains of Karath 9 for somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 years. It was not a weapon. It had been built as a communications array, the old ones said, or Cora said they said, a way of sending signal across distances that made the gap between stars look modest. But it had been found, 18 months ago, by a faction within the Vethkai warrior caste, a caste called, as best Cora could render it, something like the Keening. They had modified it. They had discovered that the frequency range of its broadcast, set to a specific harmonic, was incompatible with biological tissue of the type common to both Vethkai and humans. They had decided that this was useful. The old ones had been caretakers of the spire for longer than Cora could extract numbers for. When the Keening came, the old ones had refused to relinquish the spire's access protocols. The Keening had taken them anyway through force, through the Sentinel drones, and the old ones had been left in the crystal fields to die. They had been dying for 4 months. The Keening had not bothered to kill them outright because, Marin suspected, killing them outright would have been a mercy, and the Keening did not appear to trade in mercy. The pups were not the old one's offspring. They were orphans. The Keening's first test of the Spire's modified frequency had been run 3 months ago, at low power at range, a demonstration of capability. It had been run in the direction of a Vethkai civilian settlement. The pups were the ones who had survived, either by proximity to crystal formations that attenuated the signal, or by some developmental accident of their immature carapaces. They had been wandering the crystal fields alone for 3 months. The old ones had been bringing them in one at a time, carrying them across terrain that was clearly agony to cross in their condition, sheltering them in the hollow between the crystals. They had not stopped. They had not explained themselves. They had not been able to communicate with the survey teams who'd seen them. They had just kept going back out into the crystal fields every time they became aware of another pup, and bringing it back, and putting it with the others and going out again. Marin sat with this information for approximately 45 seconds. "Cora," she said, "can you access the Spire's systems remotely?" "Unknown. The Spire was built on a technological architecture I don't have records of. However, the Keening's modifications appear to use more standard Vethkai hardware. There may be a point of interface." "Where?" "At the base of the structure. I'm detecting a data link housing on the south face." "What would you need to shut it down?" "Access physical proximity, and approximately 40 minutes. Ren said, "The Sentinel patrol cycle is 12 minutes. There are at least 3 units in the outer ring." "Then we move the 3 units, Marin said. "Dak, Tomas, you're the distraction. Take the outer ring north and keep them occupied. Ren, you're with me." She looked at Lydia. "Can you operate a comm unit?" "Yes." "Then you're staying here with the old ones and the pups. Cora stays with you. If we go dark for more than 20 minutes. "I know," Lydia said. She did not look frightened. She looked like someone who had already been afraid for 73 hours and had worn through to something quieter on the other side. Marin looked at the old ones. The larger one was watching her with those dark, impossible eyes, and she thought about what it would have meant to have been the caretaker of something ancient and vast, to have watched that thing be taken and turned into a tool of extinction, to have spent your dying months crawling through crystal fields to carry small sleeping bodies to safety, because that was the thing in front of you that you could still do. She did not have words for what she thought about it, in the same way she did not have words for what she thought about Lydia's human medical tape on a Vethkai wound. She put her fist against her chest, a human gesture, her grandmother's gesture, something you did when you meant a thing, and held it there for a moment looking at the old one. The old one made a sound, not translation necessary, some things don't need it. The approach to the spire was 700 meters of crystal terrain that worsened as they moved. The formations grew into walls, into corridors, into something that was almost architecture if you squinted. And then, past squinting, it clearly was architecture, the crystal not grown but placed, the walls not random but purposeful, angling inward toward the spire at the center of a space that had once been a plaza and was now a killing ground. The Sentinel drones moved through it on their patrol cycle. Marin counted 3 from a crouch behind a 2-meter crystal pillar, watching their roots, feeling the spire's resonance build in the air until it was a taste at the back of her throat, copper and ozone and something that had no earthly equivalent. From the north came the sound of plasma fire, Dak's torch, raking across a sentinel's armor. The machine swiveled and began to move. A second followed it. Marin counted 3 seconds, 5, 8. Then she came out of cover low and fast with Ren behind her, and they crossed 140 meters of open crystal plaza in the time it took the remaining sentinel to complete a quarter rotation of its patrol circuit. The south face of the spire was different from what she'd seen on the approach. The crystal there had been interrupted, cut, or burned, or subjected to something that had left the lattice fractured and dark, and grafted into the fracture was a block of Vethkai hardware. Angular, functional, ugly in the way that military equipment is always ugly when you drop it into something old and beautiful. The data link housing Cora had identified was a panel set into the graft at roughly chest height. its surface covered in the angular script of Vethkai technical notation. Ren touched his comm. Cora, we're at the south interface. I'm receiving your visual feed, Cora said. I need you to open the secondary panel, the smaller one to the lower left of the primary. The seal should yield to sustained pressure at the upper right corner. Ren found it. His hands were steady. Marin stood at his back and watched the plaza for movement, and tried not to think about the resonance frequency that was building in the air around them, the way it had graduated from a taste at the back of her throat to a vibration in her sternum that felt like the early stages of a medical problem. Cora, she said, how long before the active phase reaches completion? At current cycling rate, approximately 90 minutes. And at full power, what's the primary radius of effect? A pause. From the surface of Kareth 9, I calculate the resonance field would propagate outward on a spherical envelope at approximately 3 times the speed of sound in standard atmosphere. It would reach the threshold in about 6 minutes. It would reach the nearest inhabited system in. That's enough, Marin said. I thought so, Cora said. Ren had the secondary panel open. Inside was a tangle of Vethkai interface cables and something that might have been a processing node. Marin looked at it and felt the specific helplessness of looking at technology she did not understand, built on principles she did not know, in a context she had not trained for. Cora, she said, talk him through it. I'll try, Cora said. I should note that I am working from first principles and extrapolation. If I'm wrong about the hardware architecture, you'll be wrong, talk him through it anyway. That was the next 37 minutes. Ren with his hands in alien hardware, following the guidance of an AI working at the outer edge of its competence, in a crystal plaza on a fog-choked planet, while the spire built its frequency toward the note that would unwrite every biological thing within range. While Marin stood at his back, while Dak and Tomas ran a running fight with 2 sentinel drones across the northern crystal fields, plasma fire and disruptor bursts echoing through the formations in irregular percussion. While Lydia sat in a hollow between crystal walls with 2 dying ancient aliens and a dozen sleeping pups, one hand on a comm unit, waiting. The sentinel that found them came from the east, not the patrol circuit. A reserve unit, maybe, or a unit that had been on a different route. Marin heard it before she saw it, the grinding track sound, the cycling emitter array, and turned and put herself between it and Ren and fired. Her torch opened a line across its sensor array. It fired blind and low. The beam caught the ground 6 centimeters from her left boot, and the crystal exploded upward in 1,000 prismatic fragments, each one catching the dwarf light and throwing it in every direction. And for 1 second the plaza was full of every color that existed, violent and beautiful and completely insane. She went sideways. She fired again. The sentinel's left emitter housing burst. It pivoted, searching, and she realized she had about 20 seconds before its backup targeting engaged, and she thought, switch. She had seen Ren do it at the landing site. A flat panel on the right side. Accessible. She moved in close, too close, the heat of the machine's emitters scorching the air around her face, and hit the panel with the heel of her hand. The sentinel stopped. She stood there with her hand on the dead machine's hull, breathing, the prismatic light of the shattered crystal still playing across her face. Marin, Ren's voice quiet, I've got something. She turned. He was holding a cable connection in each hand, looking at the interior of the interface housing with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Cora says if I bridge these 2 nodes, he said, it should interrupt the cycling protocol and force the spire into a dormant reset. Should. 42% confidence. And if Cora's wrong? The spire completes its cycle in the next 4 minutes instead of the next 40. Marin stood in the crystal plaza on the dead planet and thought about 42%. She thought about survey teams and distress signals in 73 hours. She thought about the old ones and the pups sleeping. She thought about Dak's daughters Braid and Tomas, who was 23, and Lydia with her burned arm and her medical tape. And she thought about the first ancient caretakers who had built this thing as a way to reach across the distances between stars, not to destroy, but to speak. She thought about what it meant that the Keening had looked at something built for communication and decided its best use was killing. "What's the other option?" she said. "There isn't one," Ren said. "Cora's exhausted the available analysis. This is the move." Marin thought about 42%. She thought about all the things she had done in worse odds, and all the things she had lost in better ones. She thought about the fact that Ren was still holding the cables, waiting, and that he was going to do it because she told him to, and that if it went wrong she would not be alive to carry that, and somehow that made it both harder and easier. "Do it," she said. He bridged the nodes. The spire did not do anything dramatic. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward, in the way that the mind keeps returning to the thing it expected that did not happen. There was no explosion, no cascade, no visible discharge. The crystal pyramid simply changed. The deep interior fires that had been building in its lattice, the amber and the violet, pulsing with the accelerating frequency, went out. Not all at once. In sections, from the base upward, as if the light were being poured out of it, the sections going dark in a slow, receding wave until only the tip was lit, and then that too faded. The resonance in the air dissolved so suddenly that Marin's ears rang with the absence of it, the way a silence after long noise is itself almost a sound. The surviving Sentinel drone stopped moving. Every unit, the two that Dak and Tomas had been running from in the northern fields, the unit Marin had shut down in the plaza, 3 others she hadn't known were there, visible now as the fog began to thin in the resonance field's absence, simply stopped. In the silence, you could hear the crystal formations settling, small tick-tick sounds as the harmonic stress they'd been under for months began to release. Ren pulled the cables apart. He looked at his hands. "Huh," he said. "Yeah," Marin said. From the comm unit, Lydia's voice, "Something just happened." "Something good," Marin said. She heard Lydia exhale. It was a very long exhale. By the time they got back to the hollow, Dak and Tomas were already there. Tomas had a burn across his forearm, not serious, but it would scar, and he was sitting with his back against a crystal formation and looking at the pups with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not succeeding. Dak was standing next to the old ones, very still, his hand resting on the head of one of the sleeping pups with the same automatic tenderness he probably didn't know he was capable of. The old ones were both awake. The larger one looked at Marin when she arrived and made the sound, the same one it had made before, the low resonant sound that Cora still couldn't fully translate. But Marin was beginning to think that full translation was not the point, and had not been the point for a while. She put her fist against her chest again. Cora said quietly in her earpiece, "The Elder's respiratory pattern has stabilized somewhat. I don't want to overstate. The internal injuries are significant, and I have no way of providing adequate medical treatment here. But the resonance field was the primary aggravating factor. With it gone, they may have more time than I originally estimated." "How much more time?" "Enough that the question of what happens to the pups is a question they might be able to help answer." Marin sat down on the crystal ground. She was tired in the specific way she got tired after an engagement that had gone better than expected, the tension unwinding too fast, leaving a particular hollow. She looked at the pups. One of them looked back at her with large dark eyes, and then, with the categorical fearlessness of the very young, walked across the hollow and sat on her foot. She looked down at it. It looked up at her. It made a sound, high, inquiring, nothing like the old one's resonant language, just the sound of something young that has not yet learned to be afraid. "Hey," she said, very quietly. It chirped back. "Cora," Marin said, "I need you to start a full analysis of the spire's original architecture. before the Keening's modifications. I want to know what this thing was really built to do. A communications array, as the elders indicated. A communications array with a range that makes interstellar distances look modest. She looked at the pup on her foot. It had settled, apparently satisfied. The Vethkai warrior caste doesn't know what they had, or they knew and they didn't care. She paused. I'd like to know which. That analysis would require more time than we have here, Cora said, and more access than I currently have. Then put in a request. Full research team, xenolinguistics, xenoarchaeology, whatever classification you need. She looked at the spire, dark now, its crystal lattice still, its extraordinary geometry visible for what it was without the malevolent light. Something old and patient waiting. We're not leaving this as wreckage for the Keening to come back to. Understood. A pause. There's one more thing. The Keening will have registered the spire's deactivation. I estimate response time, from their nearest installation, at approximately 36 hours. That's enough time to get the old one's medical support from the threshold and secure the data link access. It's also enough time to send a full report to Sector Command and request a defense perimeter. Do both, Marin said, at the same time. She stayed where she was for a moment longer, in the settling quiet of the crystal hollow. The fog had thinned further, and she could see the sky, or what passed for a sky on Kareth 9, the heavy yellow cloud layer lit from below by the dwarf star's red light. It was not beautiful by most standards. It was a dead world's light on a dead world's clouds. But the crystals caught it, and in the catching made something of it, turned the red and yellow into a spectrum. No one had planned, and no one would have predicted. And in the hollow the pups were sleeping again, and the old ones were breathing, and Lydia was sitting with Tomas, explaining to him in a patient, exhausted voice what she had observed about the Vethkai young's feeding behavior over the past 73 hours. Because she had been a scientist long enough that observation was simply what she did with consciousness. Even when consciousness was all she had left. Dak came and sat beside Marin. He didn't say anything. After a while he took a nutrition pack from his kit and opened it and handed half to her without looking. She took it. She ate. They sat in the strange alien light, while Ren went back to the spire with a portable data recorder, and began documenting everything he could reach. Good call, Dak said eventually. He was talking about the loud landing. 42%, she said. 42% is not bad. 42% is terrible. 42% is what we had, he said. He ate his half of the nutrition pack. It's usually what we have. She thought about this. She thought about the first caretakers who had built the spire as a voice, and the Keening who had turned it into a fist, and the two old ones who had spent 4 months dying slowly while carrying orphans through crystal fields, because something in them that no translator could fully reach had said, "This is the thing we can still do." What do you think it was saying, she asked. When it was built, when it was a communications array, she was looking at the dark spire. What were they trying to talk to? Whatever's out there, Dak said. He shrugged, which was his way of saying he meant it. Whoever's listening. Marin thought about that. She thought about all the things that were out there, and all the things they had found when they looked, and all the things they had not yet found and might yet. She thought about the first survey team who had come to this dead planet because someone had pointed at a crystal tooth on an orbital scan and said, "Let's go see what that is." She thought about what kind of species does that. What kind of species looks at the unknown and sends people toward it instead of away? The pup on her foot had not moved. It was asleep now, its small translucent carapace rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the untroubled young, trusting the ground beneath it to hold. "All right," she said. She looked at Dak. "Let's get the old ones back to the ship." They built a litter from equipment cases and moved the old ones with the help of Tomas, who turned out to be strong in the particular quiet way of people who have recently discovered what they're made of. The pups followed without being asked, staying close to the old ones, bunching together when the terrain was difficult, spreading out again when it eased. They moved through the crystal fields in the thinning fog, the dead world's light coming down in its accidental spectrum, and somewhere above them the threshold waited, and beyond the threshold the sector, and beyond the sector whatever was next. At the edge of the crystal field, where the formations gave way to the open ground near the landing site, Marin stopped and looked back at the spire. Dark, still, old beyond the range of any number she had easy access to, waiting in the quiet of its crystal plains. She turned and kept walking. 31 hours later, when the keening response force arrived in system and found the threshold's position, transmitting a sector command defense perimeter lock on all approach vectors, and found 6 additional vessels jumping in behind them, and found that the spire's datalink access had been fully documented, and the modification codes extracted and broadcast to every xenoarchaeological database in human-accessible space. When the Keening's commander, who would later be named in the sector debrief as a high functionary of the warrior caste's extinction division, sent a calm transmission demanding to know by what authority this action had been taken. The response that came back was from Cora, because Marin was asleep. Cora transmitted the standard sector command documentation in full, with coordinates and timestamps, and added one line at the end. The line read, "By the authority of the people who were here when you weren't." The Keening commander did not respond to that line. The Keening fleet held position for 4 hours and 11 minutes, which was exactly as long as it took for 2 more sector vessels to jump in and a third to break FTL at the system's edge. Then they withdrew. Marin read the transcript when she woke up. She read Cora's added line twice. She thought about saying something to Cora about procedural communication protocols and the importance of not improvising in diplomatic contexts. She decided not to. The old ones were in the Threshold's medical bay, responsive, stabilizing. The pups had distributed themselves throughout the ship with the calm certainty of beings who have decided that a place is safe, tucking themselves into corners and storage niches, and in one case, the co-pilot's chair, where the smallest of them sat upright and watched the stars with its large dark eyes as if it was taking notes. Tomas was in the corridor outside the medical bay, learning, with laborious persistence and Cora's help, how to say something in the Vethkai tongue. It was not clear what he was trying to say. He had been at it for 3 hours. Lydia was in the observation deck, documenting. She had borrowed a clean uniform from the supply locker, and she had her recorder out, and she was speaking quietly into it, her burned arm resting on the railing, going through everything she had observed in 73 hours on a hostile planet, with the systematic patience of a scientist who has been doing this long enough that the observer's habit has become more fundamental than the observation. Marin brought her coffee, not cold this time. Lydia looked at the coffee and then at Marin with the expression of someone who has processed a great deal of fear and come out the other side into something calmer and more permanent. "Thank you," she said. "You called it," Marin said. She meant the spire. She meant the frequency weapon. She meant the old ones and the pups. She meant 73 hours of injured scientific observation on a planet that was trying to kill her. Lydia shook her head. "I just stayed alive long enough to be useful." She looked at her recorder. "I think there's a paper in what I observed about the Vethkai Young's behavioral clustering under threat stimulus." A pause. "Probably several papers." "You should write them," Marin said. "I intend to." Lydia looked out at the stars. "There's going to be a lot to write about. The spire alone, if it was built as a communications array, and if it was built with that kind of range." She stopped. She was quiet for a moment. "Someone built it, a species we don't have records of except in AI oral tradition, a species that wanted to speak to whatever was out there. We found their voice." She paused again. "Turned into a weapon. That's worth understanding. That's worth everything we have to give it." Marin looked at the stars. The red dwarf of Karath 9 was behind them now, shrinking in the rearward cameras. The crystal planes were below it somewhere, the spire in the middle of them, dark and old and finally quiet. The defense perimeter was in place. The research request was filed. The Keening had retreated. The old ones were breathing. The pups were in the co-pilot's chair and the storage niches and the corners where things made themselves at home. She thought about what Dak had said. Whatever's out there, whoever's listening. She thought about the kind of species that builds a voice instead of a weapon and aims it at the sky. She thought about a small pup in a co-pilot's chair, watching stars it had no framework for, with the patient dark gaze of something that was going to want to understand. "Yeah," Marin said. She drank her coffee. It was hot this time. "Me too."